Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever you are. Welcome to this week's Esoteric Podcast. Today we were taking a look at the Hyperreality and Simulacra as discussed by Jean Baudrillard. Hyperreality and Simulacra are some of the most perplexing theories in the post-modernity era. Although, when correctly understood, they can reveal a new dimension of postmodernity in which the very structure of creation of reality is critically dissected. Power and control are the underlying concerns in this framework. Although they are not invested in the control of individuals or society, but in the control of reality itself. Reality, what constitutes it, and how it's controlled is the foundational concern of theories within hyperreality and simulacra. Hyperreality and simulacra evolved out of the postmodernity theoretical theme. Postmodernity refers to social, economic, political, and technological changes that have marked the transition from modern to postmodern ways of life. According to Dominic Strinacti of the University of Leicester, there are 5 aspects of postmodernity. These are the breakdown of the distinction between culture and society, an emphasis on style over substance, a breakdown of the distinction between high art and popular culture, and the decline of meta-narratives. The theory of hyperreality and simulacra stems directly from the theoretical framework of postmodernity. Jean Baudrillard was a hyperreality and simulacra's main theorist. Baudrillard was a French sociologist and philosopher from the greater part of the 20th century. His theories were descendant of Marxist theory, although they broke away in an attempt to describe postmodern society. The goal of this departure is to account for the postmodern consumer and media culture, in which it is images that have become more real than physical reality, hence the term hyperreality, and its simulation of reality which has replaced true reality, which is where we get the term simulacra. According to Baudrillard, there is an excessive amount of these media images, and they have ushered society into a new age, an age of third-order simulation. Third-order simulation is simulation where signs do not represent anything real, but only hide the absence of reality. Connection does not exist between reality and its representations, therefore hyperreality is produced. Baudrillard believed the postmodern America had escaped meaning, therefore ushering it into a new age of hyperreal. Baudrillard believed that the postmodern America had escaped meaning, therefore ushering it into a new age of the hyperreal. He also claimed an extermination of meaning within this hyperreality. There is no hidden or deeper meaning behind signs anymore. Baudrillard considers these signs without reference. Value judgments are rendered pointless in this postmodern era because any value assigned to them has no meaning in the hyperreality. This brings a worry of an empty future, one with no real meaning and no real direction. This empty future will only create a continuation of hyperreality as meaning continues to persist and is meaningless. In this hyperreal world, media and its images are dispersed all around us. The simulation we then live through is accepted as being real. This reality is inescapable. The media has infected us with a lack of meaning, restricting our ability to be critical beings. This lack of criticalness has trapped us. We mindlessly consume media, further burying us into the hyperreality. Theorists working within hyperreality and simulacra, especially Baudrillard, are concerned with power and control. The mass cannot realize the disadvantages caused by the elite when they exist within this mindless hyperreality. The media, political, economic, and cultural elite use hyperreality and its simulacra to destroy the will of the masses. Ideas of freedom and choice seem to be there, but they only exist in the simulation, therefore they have no meaning. They exist to keep the masses subordinate to the elite. Freedom within hyperreality is not freedom at all. A large part of what constitutes the simulacrum within hyperreality is non-events. Baudrillard applies this idea of non-events to the war in his book The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. He claims that the gravity of the non-event in the Gulf is even greater than the event of war. Baudrillard transforms the postmodernist idea of the non-event into the idea of non-war. He sees everyone as hostage of media intoxication. We are bombarded by images of war on our screens day by day and are trapped in this hyperreality as a hostage. This directly applies to his overarching ideas of hyperreality and simulacra. Baudrillard is also concerned with the status, meaning, and future of war as it moves from having objective to having to prove its very existence through its images. He considers this empty war. War of excess in which over-equipped countries can expend their resources, even humans. Baudrillard states that by the force of the media, this war liberates an exponential mass of stupidity, not the particular stupidity of war, which is considerable, but the professional and functional stupidity of those who pontificate in perpetual commentary on the event. Stupidity, therefore, is a product of non-war and its media coverage. The elite powers controlling war need stupidity and misinformation to glaze over the entire populace in order for their actions and procedures to be widely accepted. In the passage of Simulacra and Simulations, Baudrillard applies this theory of simulation to Disneyland. He found that Disneyland is not a representation of America, but America itself. Disneyland exists only to hide that it, in itself, is the real America. The imaginary construction of Disneyland exists only to provide false belief that the rest of America itself is real. The ultimate purpose of Disneyland is to conceal the fact that the real is no longer real, thus saving the reality principle. It keeps all of America believing that there is a difference between Disneyland and real America, therefore keeping reality itself in check. The actuality is there is no difference between what is inside and what is outside the gates of Disneyland. The same simulation that exists within Disneyland is constant throughout America. Baudrillard believes that Disneyland is simply another tool used by the media elite to reinforce hyperreality. It allows reality to exist in the minds of the people, but not in actuality. The belief that something is less real than reality itself reinforces the public's false sense of reality. To understand the simulation would be to understand that there is no discernible difference between Disneyland and reality. When discussing hyperreality and simulacra, it seems difficult to place it into context. Although there are multiple common examples of its presence in our everyday experience, one could consider themed restaurants a product of hyperreality and simulation. These restaurants use their atmosphere and experience as a selling point. These are, of course, simulated experiences. The Rainforest Cafe is a restaurant that sells itself on its simulation of a rainforest experience. The dining area is draped in foliage. The Orlando location has a fake volcano and waterfall and even animatronic animals. The Hard Rock Cafe is entirely centered on music, history, and culture. You are surrounded by paraphernalia and music videos through your entire meal. The Cracker Barrel restaurant prides itself on its southern theme and menu, and even its own country store at every location. In fact, all three businesses have a gift shop or stores attached to the corresponding restaurants. The unique experience associated with each business is really just a ploy to have you pay for both an overpriced meal and then spend more in their stores. The same way these businesses simulate alternative experiences during the meal to control our spending habits is a small example of how our realities overall are constantly controlled through simulation. The product of hyperreality relies on a lack of connection between reality and its representations, or the third-order simulation. Take, for example, the idea of colors as flavors. The idea of flavor and color are produced by two entirely different senses, although many beverages and foods are understood to have different flavors according to their corresponding color. This can be understood as product hyperreality. The flavor blue raspberry is a great example because its representation is removed completely from the original. Not only has the flavor of raspberry completely changed, but the color of the raspberry has changed from the original also. You cannot find a blue raspberry in nature. The flavor is a false simulation of what was once understood as raspberry. There is no longer a distinguishable connection between the original, therefore Blue Raspberry is part of the third order simulation and hyper-reality. The fact that movies and television and the media in general keep turning to history and various retro recreations of the past is merely a symptom of the loss of history that Baudrillard presents in one of his many essays on the subject, although we could also turn to Freud's reaction formation for this particular concept. Indeed, such media works continue the process of forgetting history. As Baudrillard writes, the NBC miniseries Holocaust, one no longer makes the Jews pass through the crematorium or the gas chamber, but through the soundtrack and the image track, through the universal screen and the microprocessor. Forgetting annihilation finally achieves its aesthetic dimension in this way. It is achieved in retro, finally elevated here to a mass level. Television, film, and the internet separates us from real even as they seek to reproduce it more faithfully. The hyperreality of communication and of meaning, more real than real, that is how the real is abolished. Our culture, according to Baudrillard, has been inundated by trashy, kitsch, mass-marketed products which contribute to our society of simulation and consumerism. This proliferation of kitsch, which is produced by industrial reproduction and the vulgarization at the level of objects of distinctive signs, taken from all registers, the bygone, the neo, the exotic, the folksy, the futuristic, and from a disordered excess of ready-made signs, it has its basis like mass culture in sociological reality of the consumer society. A culture of consumption has so much taken over our way of thinking that all reality is filtered through the logic of exchange value and advertising. As Baudrillard writes, our society thinks itself and speaks itself as a consumer society. As much as it consumes anything, it consumes itself as consumer society, as an idea. Advertising is the triumph of that idea. Baudrillard argues that the parodic, self-conscious, and self-reflective elements of pop culture forms only aid in their capitalist complicity. This false distance is presented everywhere, in spy films, in Godard, in modern advertising, which uses it continually as a cultural illusion. It is not really clear in the end whether this cool smile is the smile of humor or that of commercial complicity. This is also the case with pop. It is smiles ultimately encapsulating all of its ambiguity. It is not the smile of critical distance, but the smile of collusion. Above all else, Baudrillard keeps returning to his concept of the simulacra and the simulation to explain how our models for reality have taken over the place of real in postmodern society. Baudrillard makes 5 main points, numbering of these phenomena, to explain the loss of distinctions between reality and the simulacrum. You have media culture, contemporary media, film, television, magazines, billboards, the internet, are concerned not just with relaying information or stories, but with interpreting our most private selves for us, making us approach each other and the world through the lens of these media images. Therefore, we no longer acquire goods because of real need, but because of desires that they are increasingly defined by commercials and commercialized images, which keeps us at one step removed from the reality of our bodies and the worlds around us. The second point being exchange value. According to Karl Marx, the entrance into capitalist culture means that we cease to think of purchased goods in terms of use value, in terms of the real uses which the item will be put to. Instead, everything began to be translated into how much it is worth, into what it can be exchanged for, its exchange value. Once money became a universal equivalent against which everything in our lives is measured, things lost their material reality, real-world uses, the sweat and tears of the laborer. We began even to think of our own lives in terms of money rather than in the terms of real things we hold in our hands. How much is my time worth? How does my conspicuous consumption define me as a person? According to Baudrillard, in the postmodern age, we have lost all sense of use value. It is all capital. The third point would be multinational capitalism. As things we use are increasingly the product of complex industrial processes, we lose touch with the underlying reality of the goods we consume. Not even national identity functions in a world of multinational corporations. According to Baudrillard, it is capital that now defines our identities. We thus continue to lose touch with the material fact of the laborer, who is increasingly invisible to a consumer orientated towards retail outlets or even more impersonal internet. A common example of this is the fact that most consumers do not know how the products they consume are related to real-life things. Honestly, how many people could identify the actual plant from which coffee beans are derived? Starbucks, by contrast, increasingly defines our urban realities. Brings us nicely to point 4, urbanization. As we continue to develop available geographical locations, we lose touch with any sense of the natural world. Even natural spaces are now understood as protected, which is to say they are defined in contradiction to an urban reality, which often with its signs to point out just how real they are. Increasingly, we expect the sign, "Behold nature," to precede access to nature. Baudrillard also illustrates how in such subtle ways language keeps us from accessing reality. The earlier understanding of ideology was that it hid the truth, that it represented a false consciousness, as Marxists phrase it, keeping us from seeing the real world of the state of economic forces or of the dominant groups in power. The understanding of ideology corresponds to Baudrillard's second order of simulation. Postmodernism, on the other hand, understands ideology as a support for the very perception of reality. There is no outside ideology, according to this view, at least no outside that can be articulated in language. Because we are so reliant on language to structure our perceptions, any representation of reality is always already ideological, always already constructed by simulacra. And on that note, we come to the end of this week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed this little look into this philosophical concept. And if you did, I hope that you'll hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode, and join us over on Patreon, where you get early access and other goodies. So it leaves me just to say thank you for listening, and whoever, wherever, whatever you are, thank you, and goodbye.